All right, everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Don Ross. He is head of the School of Sociology, Philosophy, Criminology, Government and Politics at the University College Cork in Ireland, Professor of Economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and Program Director for Methodology at the Center for Economic Analysis of Risk at Georgia State University in the US. His research focuses on the foundations of economic theory, the experimental economics of addiction, risk, and time preference, philosophy of science, and infrastructure, trade, and industry policy in Africa. He's also the author of books like Economic Theory and Cognitive Science, Microexplanation, the Picoeconomics and Neuroeconomics of Disordered Gambling, and Everything Must Go, Metaphysics, Naturalized, and Philosophy of Economics. So, Dr. Ross, thank you a lot for coming on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ricardo.
Oh, it's a
Please
pleasure.
call me Doc. Please call me.
Oh, okay, I will try to do it, because here in Portugal we have this bad habit of always using the title of the person we're talking with, so... Okay, so anyway, the first question I would like to ask you is, and also because you have this book, that the last one that I referred to, about metaphysics, naturalized and things like that. So what is the naturalistic approach, and why can we be so sure that we can trust it at an epistemological level? And I also want to ask you that because it seems that even nowadays people discuss if naturalism is really the best approach to solve some issues, particularly the ones related to some metaphysical questions and also ethics and morality and other stuff like that.
Right. Well, naturalism has been used over many decades to mean different things. The most basic meaning of naturalism is simply suspension of any hypothesis of supernatural phenomena or supernatural causes. That weak form of naturalism has been prevalent in most philosophy and all philosophy of science in the West, at least for 100 years or more. It's arguably always been the prevalent philosophy of Asia. So, at least China and Japan through East Asia. That's such a weak form of naturalism, it's probably not that interesting. The kind of naturalism that James Ladyman and I defend in our book has as its opponent view, what the force of the naturalism is really denial of the idea that we can usefully approach the world when we're trying to find out what its objective character is like, when we're trying to find out about causes and processes and what exists. And we deny that when we approach those kinds of questions, we usefully do so by assuming in advance that it must conform to certain categories that arise from our everyday interaction with objects and events. That was a bit of a mouthful, so let me try and unpack it a bit. Even after most philosophers abandoned commitment to or even serious entertainment of supernatural phenomena, they continued through most of the history of what is often called analytic philosophy to suppose that their job was to take the results of science or take the results of human experience and frame them through a system of traditional metaphysical categories. Our naturalism consists in denying that that is a reliable epistemic approach, denying that that in general will deliver truth or get us closer to truth. We certainly don't insist that that pursuit of empirical science is always necessarily going to work or work well. Empirical science, the empirical science finds some domains easier and some domains harder. There may well be domains where in principle, we will never get very close to the truth, though we can't in advance know what those might be. Really, our naturalism consists simply in the view that we don't have any better alternative. There's no better method of finding out what the world is like than refining observation, modeling those observations rigorously, and testing the models against experience. In other words, empirical science is not perfect. Empirical science comes with no guarantees, but there's no other epistemological approach to objectivity that competes with it in any significant sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I would also like to ask you, what is the role that philosophy still plays in our current world and in our current affairs, and particularly when it comes to how science is conducted and how the scientific method works? Because, I mean, since philosophy was birthed, let's say, in ancient Greece, or even a little bit before that, because it is still argued. But, I mean, before the rise of the scientific method and an empirical approach to many of the questions that we want to answer, practically all of those questions were addressed by, let's say, armchair philosophers. But nowadays, many of them went from philosophy to science to resolve. So what is the role that philosophy can still play, perhaps in aiding science to do its work?
That's a great question, Ricardo. Many philosophers of science have thought and have argued that philosophy can help science in two ways, by forcing scientists to be more explicit about their methods on the one hand, and by refining and clarifying some of the concepts that scientists use in their practical, time-pressured engagements with reality. I'm skeptical about both of those possible ways in which philosophy could contribute. I don't think there is any interesting thing called the scientific method. We can talk about the scientific methods that were promoted by, say, Galileo and Bacon and Newton at the beginning of the scientific revolution. We can certainly identify their methods, but that's only because it was early days, and we're identifying their methods by contrast with the kinds of epistemological methods that were used before them. When we fast forward to the contemporary scientific scene, what we find is that most scientific progress has been made by an ever accelerating, ever deepening, ever widening division of labor. Right? It's crucial to scientific progress that scientists specialize, that individual scientists and teams of scientists become highly, highly expert on a quite specific domain of investigation. Mm-hmm. In consequence, also, we find a proliferation of concepts. So one might pick a standard concept that's used across the sciences. Take the concept of gene, right, as in biology, genetics. Well, it turns out that the concept of gene is used in importantly different ways, even within different parts of biology. Mm-hmm. It really doesn't add value, in my opinion, for philosophers to come along and ask themselves, what do all those concepts of gene have in common? And try to distill out of that some, as it were, core meaning of the concept of gene. I see no particular reason to think there should be any core meaning of that kind to be had. Gene means what it means in the context in which it's used. And the more we try to generalize about across all of those contexts, the more we just lose information. But in what I've just said is the seeds of the positive view I take concerning what philosophy can still contribute, and indeed necessarily and very, very importantly must be asked to contribute. It's a perfectly reasonable question for someone to ask. How does the world as a whole hang together? How is it possible that in one world We can have the generalizations of quantum physics, the discoveries of molecular biology, the working models of economics, what is the relationship between quantum chemistry and the various branches of quantum physics, and so on. And notice, none of these questions about how it all hangs together are no particular scientists. Answering those is not in any particular scientist's job description, just for the reasons I started off by saying. Science progresses through specialization. That's how it achieves most of its deep knowledge. But of course, the more it specializes, the more we can start to lose our grip on what the general character of the world is, how science is unified. And if we surrender that ambition, if we say, well, who cares, right? Let's just pursue all the various branches of science. Let's just have scattered islands of knowledge that we don't bother trying to connect. Well, in that case, one will have surrendered one of the, I think, core epistemic ambitions of humanity. So that's the job description for philosophers of science, making connections. So philosophers of science inevitably will know less about most sciences than the scientists who practice them do. But a good philosopher, and no philosopher of science, by the way, can have knowledge all the way across the sciences. That's simply impossible. I mean, it's not possible in one human lifetime to acquire that. Mm-hmm. But teams of philosophers, each of whom is expert on some interdisciplinary connections, can jointly contribute to the old philosophical project, which arguably was the basic philosophical project at the dawn of Hellenic civilization, saying something about the general structure and character of the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so perhaps it would be interesting to illustrate all of what you just said with a very specific example that also comes from your work. So I would like to talk a little bit about economics and the philosophy of economics, because I think that perhaps economics as a discipline has been struggling since its inception, let's say, with some big issues, and some of them I will want to talk later, particularly about how we define the economic agent and how it really works and things like that. But perhaps there are even other questions that also the approach that economists have to them have changed throughout time. And some of them might be specific to economics, and others particularly are more general to all the social sciences, because I guess that one issue that we have with the social sciences in particular is that there are several levels of analysis that we can take, from overt behavior to activity in the brain to genetics and all of those things that really complicate the picture here.
Yeah, that's right. So what's the question? You'd like an example of interdisciplinary unification?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and perhaps, so I've referred to the economic agent and how it has been defined throughout time since the inception of economics, but perhaps there are other big questions that economics also changed the way it tackles them since its beginning. So I don't know, what would you like to tell us about that specifically?
Yeah, well, the history of a science like economics looks crucially different depending on the perspective on the perspective one takes to it. So, for example, when do we regard economics as having really begun? If we regard economics as having begun with Aristotle and his practical concerns with managing a household, then it has one kind of history. If we think that economics really didn't begin until the marginal revolution of the 1870s, then it has another different kind of history. The standard view that modern economics really begins with Adam Smith and his contemporaries, I think, is a reasonable one. It's not forced, but it's one that I find illuminating. So it's the one I'll work from here. If we think of economics as that discipline that was roughly, loosely, approximately founded by Adam Smith and his immediate successors, then I think we could say that the central, persistent, big theme of the economic project is the following. Smith recognized that we build wealth, we achieve technological and material progress as a species, mainly by dividing labor and by specializing our labor. In other words, we exploit our ability to be able to give ourselves complementary roles in production. The moment we recognize that we build wealth by dividing labor, we immediately realize we've got a set of practical problems that we otherwise would not have. And one crucial practical problem is, having divided labor, we then need to design various kinds of incentive structures to coordinate that divided labor. Because there are many, many ways of dividing labor, some of them are very inefficient, others are more efficient. For any particular way of dividing labor, we can ask, is there a better way to do it? We can easily and always find worse ways to do it. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, having identified a better way to do it, or a best way to do it, we then have to ask what structures can hold it together. It's not enough to just identify the best way of coordinating divided labor. We actually have to give people reasons to want to participate in that coordination in efficient ways. That is to say, we need to design incentive schemes and design institutions. That's where it's only at that point that we start wondering about economic agency. The moment we think that our problem is a problem of figuring out how to incentivize people to reliably perform certain roles and maintain certain structures and play their parts in certain kinds of institutions, the moment we see that it's about incentives, we immediately are talking about agency, right? Agency just is that aspect of a system's response, whether we're talking about a person or a firm or a household or a labor union or a political party or a dog or an elephant, right? When we start talking about incentives, when we start talking about inducing behavior by offering certain kinds of benefits or threatening certain kinds of costs, we're talking about agents. That's what agents are. That's what, that just is what agency is. So, in other words, agency is not conceptually primordial here. We face issues in modeling agency because of the deeper target of economic explanation and inquiry, namely incentives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, is it the case that that in economics we have different approaches when we're analyzing economic events or economic phenomena at different levels? Like, for example, when we're analyzing phenomena that are part of macroeconomics and microeconomics, and perhaps when we're analyzing individual and collective agents, or not?
Yes, of course. Those are challenges. I mean, something that I think confuses many people about economics, including many economics students, because of the way we teach economics, particularly at the undergraduate level, is the relationship between modeling individuals and modeling groups. In teaching economics, we often start with Robinson Crusoe, this lone agent alone on an island who has to decide how to allocate his time between, say, making a fishing rod and harvesting fruit out of the trees. And then once he's got his fishing rod, how much of the day should he spend fishing? How much should he spend looking for fruit? And so on, right? We do all that because one of the things we're trying to teach the students at that point is really how to solve optimization problems using calculus. Right, and that's a convenient setting for doing that. That gives the impression that somehow economics is fundamentally and in the first place about individual behavior. And that creates a real disconnect in students' expectations about what they're going to go on to learn. Because, in fact, economists are very seldom interested in individuals and in individual behavior. Almost all of, if you just pull any issue of a top economics journal off the shelf and look at what the papers are about, They're almost all about household responses or firm responses or the coordination of firms or the relationships between firms as producers and households as consumers. Very, very little is about individuals. It's quite unusual in economics, for example, to model the utility function of an individual. There are circumstances under which one does do it, and my group does it to an unusual extent for reasons we might get into later. But it's actually not common. I would argue, and you might want to follow this up, but I'll hand back to you for that. I would argue that if you are really serious about doing an economics of the individual human being, then what you're going to be doing is Picoeconomics, or what George Ainsley calls Picoeconomics. But very few economists actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about Picoeconomics, but just before that, I would also want you to tell us about this. There has been throughout most of economics history this wrong idea that, or at least that we nowadays know that it is not really correct, the idea of individuals acting as rational agents or what has been called homo economicus. But is it true that at the individual level that idea doesn't really hold water, but perhaps when we're talking about collectives, that perhaps there's something to it, and perhaps we would have rationality, let's say, as an emergent property, or not?
Well, these are very, very complicated matters, and I'll have to ask you to be a bit patient as I
Sure.
pull them apart. So a first point is that I think the Homo economicus is given much more prominence in certain kinds of popular myths about economics than it has actually played in real economics. There is no trace, really, of Homo economicus in the first half of the 20th century economics. Homo economicus does not show up.
Mm-hmm.
There's no Homo economicus in Adam Smith. There's no Homo economicus in Ricardo or Marx. You can see traces of him in John Stuart Mill, but you would certainly Homo economicus is certainly not the star of the story in Mill's political economy. When the rational maximizing consumer is rigorously defined for the first time in the history of economics in Paul Samuelson's work just after World War II. Mm-hmm. Samuelson himself, in the chapter where he constructs that model, says at the end of the chapter that he doesn't know whether this model really has any particular grip on reality. And furthermore, he says, if it doesn't really matter. And why would one say there's Homo economicus finally being, as it were, nailed into being, and the person doing the nailing says it doesn't matter whether this really has any great empirical applicability, and to bear that out in the rest of Samuelson's 500-page text, that analysis does not do any more work. So indeed, you can see why Samuelson thinks it wouldn't matter. The concept isn't really used again. Why does he bother then to do that analysis? He's really doing that analysis as a way of pinning down for mathematical modeling purposes some concepts that have nothing in particular to do with individual human beings. He's trying to nail down relationships between, for example, marginal demand and marginal consumption. He's trying to find a way of representing diminishing marginal returns in a way that doesn't appeal to any psychological properties, because he knows we're going to want to apply those concepts to what firms do, to what households do, to all sorts of entities, and we need to mathematically mean the same thing each time we do one of those analyses. Again, there's that textbook model of Robinson Crusoe. So the first time the student encounters those concepts about optimization on margins and those concepts relating to demand and time allocation and so on, they see them in this cartoon setting of an individual person making these simple decisions about how to allocate their resources. And then they naively think, right, well, that's what economics is about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is true that economics, along with Western philosophy and social sciences in general, during the 20th century, passed through an intensely atomistic phase. That is, it passed through a phase in which the intellectual culture of the sciences was heavily analytic. That is to say, a lot of energy was put in to figuring out how we could understand systems by decomposing them into their parts.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you are studying society or you're studying social groups, and you think that one of the things you should do is decompose them into their parts to gain enlightenment and insight, then those parts will naturally be human beings, individual people. You'll think of those as the sort of fundamental parts. You'll think of the people as the atoms. And then, of course, if you're doing this as an economist, you say, well, do I have a model of these atoms? Yeah, there it is. It's in Samuelson, right? It's Homo economicus, right? It's that individual who is perfectly efficient in the way, who perfectly efficiently optimizes given a budget constraint, right? That's what Homo economicus does. Mixed up with all of that is yet another thing. Economic rationality, as people discuss it and as you see it in textbooks, it partly involves being very efficient with respect to being as efficient as possible with respect to one's resources, and being perfectly consistent in one's preferences, since if you're not perfectly consistent in your preferences, you can't possibly expect to be consistent in your use of resources, right? If you change your mind, that will have implications for how the choices you made yesterday, some of them will need revision. Well, to that extent, I guess you weren't efficient, were you? But then it also comes to involve, right? If economic rationality also comes to involve the idea of making use of all information that is in principle available about whatever problem you're facing. Now, that's a very, very strange concept of rationality. It has nothing to do with rationality in any psychological sense at all, right? Nobody thinks that psychological rationality requires that one actually use all information that is in principle available, right? Try living your life like that, right? It's impossible for a minute. So why does that feature in economics? It doesn't feature in economics because any economist was ever so foolish as to think that that was something individual people do or should do. It's reflected in economics because economists don't want economics is a policy science, and economists are wary of giving advice to policymakers that will only work if the people to whom the policy is being applied are assumed to be in principle ignorant about something, right? If you make a policy that requires that everybody stay ignorant, well, sooner or later they'll cure that ignorance. So you model as if all the information will be picked up in the system, not because you think it actually is or will be, but because it's extremely dangerous and guaranteed to fail. If you model the system, if your model of the system, your model of the intervention you're going to make on the system depends on the perpetuation of some special ignorance. Well, that's a lot that I've just been through, so let me try to summarize it.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there's no simple concept of economic rationality. Economists use rationality in a variety of different ways, which are clear to them from context. Critics then step back and try to distill or analyze out a general concept of economic rationality that always leads them to say things that aren't true, that always leads to outrageous simplification of what economists are really doing. Second, the idea of the perfectly rational economic individual is a concept of actually very little importance in economics. Samuelson was quite right about that. It's very useful to learn that concept for the sake of learning other concepts. It's very useful to kind of have that concept in mind when you're writing down a model of what is usually an agent that is typically not an individual person, like a labor union or a company. But economists are not in the business and have never been in the business of modeling the world as if individual human beings map onto Homo economicus. I'll make just one caveat, and this is also an important contributor to the current mythology. There was a group of economists who were concentrated at the University of Chicago in the late 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s, who actually tried to make a serious go of the program of modeling individual people as if they were approximated by Homo economicus. I think that program yielded some insights, but among the famous leading programs of economics, I think it was among the most barren in its upshots. I think it was it's one of the few big movements in economics that I think actually created more confusion than enlightenment. Unfortunately, those economists were also very good self-promoters, and quite a lot of people got the idea that they were representative of the discipline. Let me caveat on the caveat. I think they were all brilliant people. I'm glad they did the work that they did. Gary Becker fully deserves the Nobel Prize that he got. I'm really complaining about the way in which the self-mythologizing of those economists got picked up and inflated and amplified and generalized. That's the closest. If you want, though, to see that kind of mythological Homo economicus-based economics at work, that's where you look. Just remember when you're looking there, this is not representative of the discipline as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and since we're talking about the behavior of an animal, that in this case is Homo sapiens, and how it responds to certain environmental cues, and also our innate biases and heuristics in dealing, in this case, with economic information, and how we construct our societies and, of course, our socialization in general. So could you please expand a little bit more on the relationship between economics and other social sciences like psychology and sociology and other things like that? And I don't know if you would prefer to highlight more the differences or the similarities or perhaps the interplay between them.
Let me start with psychology, because I think the story there is more complicated, and it's certainly it connects more directly with the themes we were just talking about a moment ago. There is, of course, such a thing as social psychology, and social psychology arguably is growing in importance within psychology as a whole. So let me just bracket that, because nothing that I'm about to say really applies to social psychology, right? These disciplines are moving things, they're living things, and psychology will change. So when I talk about psychology, I'm talking about psychology as it has been dominated by its main parts over the past few decades. Thus qualified, psychology really is about individuals. Mm-hmm. The primary explanatory target of the psychologist really is, how does the individual human being, as a motivated, thinking, feeling, perceiving, knowing, acting entity work, right? How does that thing mechanically work? How do the various processes that are going on in the brain of that thing drive its behavior, unify its perceptions, inform its consciousness, cause and modulate its motivations, and so on. Right? That's ultimately what psychologists are interested in. As I was stressing a few minutes ago, that is not what economists are interested in. Let me tell a story that I think can help illustrate the point. I have, as an economist, often done experiments with psychologists, and in the about 10 years ago, 10 to 12 years ago, I ran a series of experiments on problem gamblers with psychologists. And when we used to design our experiments, there would be some psychologists in the room and some economists. And as we were designing the experiments and troubleshooting our experimental designs, we would naturally identify some factors that we needed to take into account that would probably arise and affect the experiment that we hadn't thought of when we did our first pass design. That's how you do experimental design. You start with a kind of rough sketch and then you troubleshoot it. Every time there was a common pattern I soon noticed, that when we identified a factor that we hadn't considered that would possibly affect our results or our observations, the instinct of the psychologists was to figure out how we could wall that factor out of the lab. Right? They would call it a confound. Right? That's what it's known as. And they would say, we've got to get that confound out. We've got to block its operation. Mm-hmm. The economists would have exactly the opposite approach. Having identified the factor, their approach would be saying, how can we get that factor into the lab in a controlled way? Right? Which usually would mean spending more money, because the way you would bring the confound into the lab in a controlled way is you would take a subset of your participants, of your subjects, and make a new as we call treatment group of them. That is, you'd actually deliberately subject them to the new factor in a way that differed from the exposure to that factor of your other groups. That's how you would bring the factor into the lab. This says a lot to me. This revealed a lot to me about the difference between psychology and economics. Why did the psychologists always want to block things out of the lab? Because the reason is because the ultimate explanatory ideal for the psychologists is the person operating by means of their, as it were, raw brain. Right? The person stripped out of their context, so they've got to use the native resources that they either were born with or have learned, so that we're finding out how the mechanisms and the internal processes, as it were, of the person really operate. The economist is actually a social scientist. The economist is typically interested in how some structures work. They're interested in how some socialized and institutionalized processes actually unfold. So the economist wants to bring as much of the world into the lab as she possibly can. Exactly the opposite to what the psychologist does. I think this generalizes. Despite the so-called individualism for which economists are famous, the interest of the economist ultimately is a person embedded in a market or embedded in a set of institutions like firms and so on, households. And for the economist, the specific information processing that goes on within the person is of no special interest. The economist it matters every bit as much to the economist information that is processed externally to the person, information that is processed in the person's environment and that the person just uses, or that just affects the person, even without perhaps the person being aware of it. Those things, all of those sources of information, all of that information processing is of equal interest to the economist. And often the economist doesn't really care whether the information is being processed in the person, by the person in their brain, or in the environment that the person is using. Whereas those distinctions matter a great deal to the psychologist. They're really what psychology is about. Now, sociology, then, is not as distinct from economics as psychology is. Economics is a social science, and sociology is a social science. Some might even argue that sociology is kind of the core social science, in the sense that sociologists will regard anything that is social as falling within their explanatory purview. I think that the The disciplinary distinction between economics and sociology is largely a historical artifact. That is, it's a product of some complicated historical factors that happened to be present in the intellectual environment in which the formal social sciences were born in the 19th century, given the particular investigative techniques that were available to people, given the way other sciences like psychology and biology were then being practiced. Sociologists and economists looked like to each other, looked like they were doing very, very different things. I think that we're gradually starting to realize that the project of the social sciences actually requires both sociology and economics. That is requires reflection on the phenomena that economists have studied, but also the phenomena that sociologists study. Sociologists are no longer allergic to mathematics in the way that they were incentivized to be for most of the 20th century. Economists are quite willing to model and talk about power differentials, which some of them in the 20th century were allergic to, and which therefore became kind of defining focus of sociology. I think there are good reasons to think that the only things now keeping sociology and economics from merging into a single transdisciplinary social science are institutional factors, as opposed to deep philosophical or epistemological factors.
Right. Okay, so let's now finally get into Picoeconomics, because you've already alluded to this in an early answer, and you refer to the fact that perhaps this would be the best approach in economics to really study the individual agent. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that, and also tell us which are the main aspects that Picoeconomics focus on?
Right. So let me start by saying that I am not, when I emphasize Picoeconomics, I'm not urging that economists in general should take it up. I've already stressed that I think the main concerns of economists are social concerns rather than concerns about the way individuals work. And to that extent, most economists can now and will be able to go on living their whole lives in blissful ignorance of Picoeconomics. So I'm not suggesting Picoeconomics should take center stage in the discipline as a whole. What I do think is there is value to be had often in applying some of the conceptual distinctions and some of the modeling approaches that economists use to thinking about individuals. There are various programs available for doing that. One of them is neuroeconomics. Picoeconomics is another one. I think the Picoeconomic insights have consistently been more interesting and promising than the neuroeconomic ones. Picoeconomics, the word, the concept, and indeed the fundamental insights come from the American psychiatrist and research psychiatrist George Ainsley. And Ainsley's more informed by psychology and psychiatry than he is by economics. He really just borrowed some very general economic concepts, particularly concepts from game theory, and applied them to think about the motivational conflicts that arise within a person. So the fundamental insight there is just this. When you do focus on the individual as an agent, one of the things you quickly have to recognize is that as an information processing system, that agent is very, very, very complicated. Our brains are, from an analytical point of view, massive. Right? There are 13 trillion human brain. That's a bigger number than cosmologists deal with when they're thinking about stars and galaxies. Right? It's a huge number. There's an awful lot going on in that thing in your head. And of course, given how much information it processes in real time, it's It didn't take very much computer science to realize that it can't possibly be processing that information in a centralized sequential way. Right? If your brain processed everything as if it were a problem in logic to be decomposed and then solved step by step, if that's how your brain worked, what you would be is a kind of walking Soviet Union, right? That is, and you would fail for the same reason it did, right? You'd simply be incapable of responding with any level of adequate efficiency to any real problem. Mm-hmm. So we know that the human brain, and for that matter, the mouse brain, works by radically decentralizing its information processing, when lots of things are going on simultaneously. Just as a human national economy or a big firm's processes can only work through decentralization and division of labor, the brain also must divide labor. Some parts of your brain are busy on one sort of problem, and other parts of your brain are adapted to other parts of problems. But there's no central coordinator in your brain, just as there isn't a central coordinator in a market economy. There are all these specialists working away. They somehow have to stay coordinated, but there's nobody to coordinate them. Right? They're not coordinated by having a chief executive. Well, so how does it get sorted out? Basically the same way it gets sorted out in a market. There's implicit value being computed by those different systems, and those values are just realized in the returns and rewards that come to the systems as separate parts and the system as a whole that they compose. So it's you can use the model of market dynamics to explain a lot of the way in which interests in your brain, different possibility spaces opened by the activities of different subparts of you as a person, the way in which they are coordinated and often fail to coordinate, you can understand that using the conceptual resources of economics. Let's be careful about how much you're understanding. You're not going to understand everything about a person that way. You wouldn't be trying to. Mm-hmm. You're trying to, you won't understand, for example, the biochemistry of emotion that way. But that's a huge part of understanding human behavior. You won't understand the way visual perception works that way, but that's a huge part of a human's psychology. But you will understand the thing. You can use those concepts. You can use those models to understand the kinds of things those models were built to furnish understanding of. Namely, how do you get apparent unified value, like system-wide prices, out of a bunch of value computations that are all distributed across throughout the system and that don't have any central command bottleneck. You can understand how the system manages to stay coherent in general, even while it's often incoherent in detail, just as a market is. In other words, you can understand the properties of the brain that are market-like. Not all properties of the brain are market-like, but some of them are. And where they are, economic modeling is the technology to reach for. That's George Ainsley's insight. He particularly applied it to understand addiction, and he applied it to addiction because addiction is a particularly puzzling phenomenon from the point of view of an emphasis on agency. Right? Addiction seems to be a case where our agency gets away from us. But addiction is by no means the only phenomenon that it can be applied to. We've applied it to procrastination. We've applied it to generally to ambivalence that people display about their preferences. Right? People who, on the one hand, seem to have a very strong preference for a stable domestic life, and at the same time a strong preference for blowing that domestic stability up, and so on. Right? All of these forms of ambivalence. That's Picoeconomics. Again, I think it will, to repeat what I said earlier, I don't think Picoeconomics will ever be a central part of economics. I don't think economists in general need to engage with it. But if some part of an economist's problem crucially trades on how individuals work, that's not usually the case. But when that does arise, read Picoeconomics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I would like to ask you to please tell us a little bit about the work that you and some of your colleagues have done on the mechanisms of addiction and its relation with the decision-making processes that go into it from an economics approach. Because I mean, perhaps, and I'm not sure if this is correct or not, and please tell me if it's not, but perhaps when in psychology, and in this case in particular in clinical psychology, people have this approach of pathologizing certain sets of behavior, perhaps that approach leads them to miss certain important aspects of how people develop those behaviors. And again, I'm not sure if I'm saying something right here or not. But
Good. So let me come at it this way. I would certainly assent to the idea that addiction is a pathology in general. In the sense, addiction is a quite serious public health problem. That is, it has lots and lots of very severe negative welfare consequences for people, and households. Also, it's just a fact that most addicts are quite unhappy, and most addicts wish they had not been addicted. Most addicts, it's important to note, solve their problem eventually, and most addicts solve their problem by themselves. That is, without clinical assistance. Though I say by themselves, I mean without clinical assistance. Most addicts do depend very much on the help and support of their of their families and friends. It's actually quite difficult to solve your addiction problem literally, truly by yourself, but upwards of 70% of addicts recover without any help from the medical establishment or the counseling establishment. But lots of unhappiness along the way, lots of loss. So it's a problem, and a quite big one. Now, when you talk about sometimes when we complain about the pathologizing of addiction, what we really mean is we are worried about the tendency in clinical sciences to model addiction as if it were a classical disease. That is, as if it represented the malfunctioning of the brain or some part of the brain.
Okay.
Now, I do think there is some legitimate grounds for concern there. I think it's a fair thing to say, a broadly true thing to say, that in the case of addiction, the part of the brain, or the processes in the brain that are most directly implicated, are not actually malfunctioning. Addiction results from the reward system of the brain, a very old part of the brain that we share with all vertebrates. Addiction results from that part of the brain functioning just as nature designed it to do, under circumstances that evolution could not anticipate. That is, under circumstances that we have ourselves set up in the world that create traps for that system. And that's, we're vulnerable to addiction basically because our ancestors were not really much at risk of it. They didn't have enough control over their environment to be able to create the conditions where that vulnerability in the design of the reward system could be exploited. So basically, addicts are, as to a first approximation anyway, they're people with normally functioning reward systems that have been drawn into or dragged into a kind of learning trap where they, as a result of the way the system normally functions, they get stuck. And among the things that you need to do to unstick them is you've got typically to change their environment. I mean, one of the most important kinds of therapy for those addicts who do come for help is there's various things you must do, but one thing you must do is you've got to change their environment. As long as the environment they're trying to learn about and derive reward from continues to have the properties that trigger the addiction, they will keep relapsing. They'll keep falling back into that trap.
So, would you say that perhaps when people refer to certain alterations that occur in the brain in terms of the levels of certain neurotransmitters and hormones and the activation of certain areas that do not activate in normal people or vice versa, that those things are not really the crux of the issue, or perhaps they derive from the fact that people are exposed to certain environmental cues mostly?
Yeah, well, so I'm not suggesting that they aren't in some sense the crux of the issue. So an addict, someone who is sort of fully addicted, whether to nicotine or to heroin or to cocaine or to gambling, someone who's actually reached the fully mature stage of addiction, that is a person in whom certain neuroadaptations have occurred. That is, there have been transformations in their brains. Quite specifically, what's happening is certain chemical signals from frontal cortex that usually prevent the old midbrain system, the dopamine system in the midbrain, from directly triggering motor preparation, from directly preparing the body to consume, those blocking signals aren't happening. So as soon as the addict, is given any kind of cue for lighting up a cigarette or pouring another drink, as soon as they get any cue that reminds them of that, they will immediately experience a visceral urge. That is, their whole body will go into consumption preparation mode. And what is really anhedotic about addiction, what makes addiction kind of miserable, the worst part of it for the actual addict, is because their body is constantly being set into these hyper alert states for consumption of their addictive target, they find it very difficult to focus on anything else. Right? The worst thing about addiction is the way the addiction crowds out the rest of the addict's life. With certain addictions that can be coped with. Smoking is an easy addiction to cope with compared to the others, though it's very, very dangerous to health. But smoking is an easy addiction to cope with because basically you can smoke and do other things at the same time. That's why smokers smoke all the time. Right? And that's why smokers particularly need to smoke when they have to concentrate on something. Right? Because the only way to keep that urge to smoke from crowding out whatever it is they want to concentrate on is to be smoking, right? So smokers famously smoke more the more harder they work, or the more they're concentrating. And it's a smoker who's writing a hard letter or a difficult letter, or who's got a big report to do will smoke more than normal, and that's why. So. And of course, most of the things that people get addicted to, like alcohol and cocaine and gambling, are not things you can easily do while you concentrate on other things. So, and then of course, there's the fact that also addictive substances tend to be medically harmful, nicotine especially. Well, not nicotine actually. It's smoke. It's tobacco that's harmful. Anyway. Sorry, now where were we? Remind me of the question we were. Am I arguing that addiction is not a condition of the brain? It is a condition of the brain. What I was trying to emphasize before is it doesn't result from some organ in the brain being damaged in some way, or responding in a way that it isn't supposed to. Addiction represents the exercise of perfectly normal reward learning but about some ways of getting reward that were not available to our ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one way to think about it that I think is another story which is good for illustrating what I'm getting at. In Africa, there are some trees, marula trees, where every now and then the berries ferment while they're still on the vines of the trees instead of only after falling to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
When that happens, the berries are not poisonous as they normally would be, but they're fermented. So so an animal eating them can get drunk.
Right.
When various animals come across the berries in that state, for example, baboons, under some circumstances, perhaps elephants, but some birds, particularly baboons are a good case. When baboons come across that, baboons have a party. Right? The baboons show no particular risk. They eat as many of the berries as they can, and they get falling, and quite dangerous. It's dangerous to be a drunk baboon, right? You have predators, right? You really don't want a leopard coming along while you're drunk,
Sure.
if you're a baboon. So they're taking some risks. They're having a good time, quite clearly. If baboons could plant marula trees, if baboons could treat the planted marula trees in ways that encouraged the berries to ferment on the vine, baboons would have an addiction problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Their brains aren't misfunctioning when they have a party. They've discovered an opportunity. Their brains learn about the opportunity. Their brains deliver behavior that exploits the opportunity. Right? It's a happy day for baboons. They would only get into trouble if they could control the environment in such a way that they can constantly be presenting themselves with that opportunity. And then their brains would not have a defense, have no natural defense against over-exploiting that opportunity they've created. Now, of course, we are like those baboons who have been able to plant marula trees, who can treat the marula trees in such a way as to constantly produce the party. And then our brains do not have natural defenses to prevent us from over-exploiting those opportunities, and so that's what a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very interesting example. And so perhaps just two more questions. And now, before we finish, I would like to circle all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. And I think that it's very interesting that we've just talked about different approaches to the same set of behaviors here, in this case addiction, because in order for us to understand the world, we always have to rely on certain models of it. We can't really take into account, and now I've talked about circling all the way back because I'm referring again to the naturalistic approach. But when we create models of the world, we necessarily have to exclude certain aspects, and some of them perhaps are even causally relevant, that we still don't know of, or perhaps are too complex to compute in, or we don't have the necessary technology to do it yet. So, these are also things, and it doesn't matter if we're doing mathematical modeling or other type of modeling, these are also things that we have to take into account as limitations to this epistemological approach, correct?
That's absolutely right. One of the reasons why I say there's no such thing as the scientific method, right? You can't do science as if it's a cookbook, right? That is, you can't find recipes that you just have to follow and boom, then you'll deliver the epistemic pay dirt. The reason is that there's a fundamental tension in modeling. Modeling isn't something incidental to science. Modeling is science. Right? That's if you want one generalization about what science is that you can fit on the T-shirt, that's a pretty good one. Science is modeling. To see why that's so, I'll describe for you one model of the universe that is guaranteed to be the true model. The universe. Right? The universe is guaranteed to be the true model of itself. Right? That doesn't get us anything epistemically. Right? We only achieve any epistemic purpose in understanding that universe by simplifying. That is, by extracting, right, certain aspects and identifying those as causal relationships that are worth paying attention to, or as being the systems that, when we understand them, help us understand other things. Right? All of science involves trying to pull certain features, certain process, certain relations out of the background into the foreground and focusing on them in isolation. Right? All explanation, all attempt to discover generalizations, it always involves artificially isolating some parts of a system and backgrounding the rest. So there's a kind of deep irony here. To gain truth, you always have to engage judiciously in a bit of falsehood, right? Because it's false that those other things really are in the background. From the point of view of the objective nature of the universe, there's no background and foreground. That only arises for a perspective. That only arises for somebody who's, for somebody regarding or representing that system. So we judiciously engage in misrepresentation in order to try and arrive at better, more powerful, true representation. Because the world is structured in the different parts of the world and the different dimensions of the world are structured in very different ways, the kind of modeling that works in one case will be very different from the kind of modeling that works in another case. Science is very much an art. It's very much a craft. It's very much something one has to learn in part by doing, right? Hence my emphasis on don't think you can set it out like a cookbook. So the happy scientist is a scientist who has learned not to be anxious about the fact that modeling is what they do, who's learned to be comfortable with the fact that all of her models are misrepresentations in some sense. Of course, she'll be the best scientist, or she'll be a better scientist to the extent that she's self-aware, right, of the fact that that's what her models are doing. So that she's reminds herself at each stage of modeling that there's a bunch of factors that she's put into the background. And she'll be a better scientist to the extent that she's always prepared to reach into that background and pull some of those things into the foreground when she gets reason to believe that she made a mistake, or that she, and of course, science is not pursued by, I'm talking about she and her as if it's an individual. Science is done by communities. So it's the scientific community that will recognize at some stages that it's time to change the modeling approach. It's not even necessarily the case that these are always involved correcting mistakes. Take the history of physics. Newton put almost everything into the background when he derived his laws of gravitation, theory of gravitation. Right. He focused on an extremely narrow set of relationships and then basically pretended that that extremely narrow set of relationships was the fundamental set of relationships for absolutely everything. So it was a very, very extreme and severe simplification. What resulted was the most, one of the most powerful scientific models ever devised. Indeed, that was the scientific sort of model that motored the creation of all the others. Later, right, we realized that simplification is just wrong. Right? It's useful for certain purposes, for certain engineering purposes, but that's just not true physics at all. Right? The changes that had to be made by Einstein and by the quantum physicists um, uh, weren't just minor modifications on Newton; they were a replacement, a generalization, but really fundamentally a new thing entirely. And but it's not like we said, "Oh, that was a mistake," right? Old Newton, right? We had to correct that. We had to fix that. No, thank goodness Newton did that. We never would have got where we are now if that hadn't been done first. So that's another reason why science will never end. Science will never end because we have no reason to think that there's any such thing as a final, ultimate, best way of modeling everything. Right? Very often in science, when you improve your modeling approach to some phenomena, you pay a cost in sort of losing your grip on the best modeling approach to some other phenomena. There's a lot of trade-offs of that kind. If you are somebody who thinks that either science must be converging on an ultimate truth, or it's no good, or it's useless, well then you're going to be disappointed. But a happy attitude to science is one that takes joy in the fact that it will go on forever. Mm-hmm. And going on forever is great. Learning is one of the most fun things that a person can do. And collective learning together, is one of the most joyful ways in which we can relate as people. So it's wonderful to be a scientist, and that's why.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so just one last question, and because this also interests me personally. So we've been talking about throughout the entire interview basically about how science is not really, in terms of approach and in terms of modeling, at least yet, a unified thing. And perhaps at different levels of analysis we need different sorts of modeling. But I mean at the same time, you at a certain point you also refer to the fact that it should be important for us to have at least a certain continuity between the sciences. Perhaps here we could use the term that E.O. Wilson coined, consilience, that I think he referred there to the unity of all the sciences, from the social sciences and even down to physics, I guess, that he was referring to all the sciences there in terms of unity and continuity. But does this tell something about how to solve the contentious discussion between the reductionists and the emergentists? Because I mean, I've already talked with a lot of philosophers and scientists about this issue, and I mean it's very difficult for us to imagine that we can, for example, extract laws of social behavior from laws of physics, for example, or to predict how people behave based on the interaction of particles at the atomic level or something like that. But on the other hand, emergentism seems to have a particular issue with it, that is the fact that it seems to leave out certain aspects because it doesn't refer to how we get from one place to another, and at a certain point in the discussion it seems that people are referring to some spooky things that go around there somewhere. But on the other hand, it could also be that those spooky things are just the knowledge that we lack. So I mean, I'm not sure if I was able to articulate this correctly, but anyway, if you could comment on it.
So I think that a lot of the controversy and confusion around reductionism arises from people assimilating or running together two different senses of reduction. So, on the one hand, theories sometimes approximately reduce other theories. That is, sometimes you see that two theories are talking about very similar processes, but one of the theories is maybe talking about those processes in a more elegant or a more compressed way, in which case you might say that that more elegant, more compressed theory reduces the other theory. If we're at the level of models, right, we can say the same thing. And those models might be of different domains. I was just reading some recent work a couple of days ago in which some physicists think that they've got an explanation or the beginning of an explanation of why neural networks, the sorts that our brains instantiate and that are now learning to build in AI systems, these physicists think they've got an explanation of why they are so surprisingly efficient. And the explanation involves recognizing commonalities between the models that neural networks instantiate and the models the physicists think characterize the basic structure of quantum reality. Right? Now, they're not reducing, but notice in what sense that is a reduction. They're not saying we understand brains by breaking them down into their constituent particles. Right? That's not what's going on. They're recognizing a structural analogy between the models the neural networks represent and the models that the physicists use of quantum phenomena. And they're recognizing that isomorphism, that common structure, provides an explanation. Notice there's an asymmetry. They're not trying to explain the physics by reference to the neural networks. They're trying to explain the neural networks by reference to the physics.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that asymmetry need not reflect some metaphysical hunch to the effect that ultimately there's nothing to a brain except chemicals, and there's nothing to the chemicals except subatomic particles. Story then about the subatomic particles, there'd be no need to do the chemistry or no need to do the neuroscience. Right? That doesn't follow. Physics has nothing. In the language of physics, there are no neurons. In the language of physics, there are no hopes and dreams. There are no emotions. There are no different kinds of brain structures. Right? Physics can't see that level, that scale of generalization, and it isn't trying to. And you cannot explain, you will not explain what a neuron does by pretending that the neuron is just a glued together bunch of subatomic particles. First a bunch of atoms, and then those atoms are a bunch of glued. That's just not, the universe isn't, reality is not composed additively. It's not composed by just adding up a lot of little things and getting some big things. So that kind of reduction, once in a while in the history of science, you see progress made by that kind of decomposition, but it's unusual. It arises only under very special and occasional circumstances. It's very, very, very far indeed from the general way we make progress in science. But we very, very often make progress in science by searching for structural level isomorphisms between different phenomena, by recognizing that we can build similar kinds of models and we can transfer insights from one class of models over to another. And finally, there's the asymmetry to come back to. I said, well, we explain the neuroscience in terms of the physics, not the other way around. Why? Not because we think that physics is trying to provide an ultimately complete account of everything, but rather, physics is just the science. Physics is our class of scientific models that apply most generally. That is, compare physics with biology. Compare fundamental physics, anyway, with biology. So, right, quantum physics, let's say. quantum physical models apply everywhere in the universe. Biological models, as far as we now know, apply only for a part of the history of one planet.
Right.
The biological models are very special. Quantum physical models are very, very general. So when they conflict, right, if you have a conflict between the physical model, the very general one, and the very special model, the biological one, it's the biological model you adjust. You don't need to justify that by saying, well, it's because all the biological things are made out of little physical things. Right? Well, you could say that, but it's false, so you shouldn't. And what you're not forced there. There's lots of other things you can say instead. And one of the things you can say instead is all the biological systems, as a matter of fact, evolved within constraints. They evolved within the constraints that the special world had to be part of the general world. And the general world is the world that's described by fundamental physics. So, of course, the special system has to be compatible with, right? It has to be coherent with, consistent with that more general picture. And that's why, right, that's why we explain biology in terms of physics sometimes, but we never explain physics in terms of biology. Again, not because of reduction, not because we think the one thing's made of the other thing, but because those are the hierarchical relationships among our models, which we recognize only when we transcend the division of labor and say, hey, we live in a world where the generalizations of biology hold, and the generalizations of physics also hold. Mm-hmm. What kind of world is that? Now we're doing philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So, Don, just before we go, would you like just to tell people, apart from your books, what are some of the best places on the internet if they want to get in touch with more of your work?
Oh, gee, well, of course, my own website is academia.edu. Most of my recent working papers, including, so what I have there are versions of papers prior to their publication. So publishers generally will not let you post on your own website the final published version of a paper because they hold the rights to that and they want to sell those things. But they will let you publish a version of the text that is identical. It's just not formatted and paginated and typeset, by the journal, but it was the version that the journal accepted. So those papers are available on my website. Something we haven't much touched on in this interview, a lot of the current work that I'm doing is experimental work associated with risk preferences. And that work is done in company with a team of other researchers based out mainly we're organized as the Center for Economic Analysis of Risk. If listeners who are interested in that side of our work, the experimental work on risk preferences, can find a wealth of our group's working papers at the SEER website. So that's CEAR. There's at least one other organization called SEER, so make sure if you're looking for the SEER website that it's got risk in the title.
Okay. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of this video. And so, Don, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone. And as you said, we didn't really have the time to touch on other aspects of your work. So perhaps in the future, if you like, we could have another conversation.
That would be great. Thanks very much for the interview. You asked great questions, and it was a pleasure answering them. I hope your listeners were able to follow at least some of it.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Hi everybody, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end, and also by the way for coming to my channel. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep this channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even if just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford and Hans Frederick Sunda. Thank you for all.